back. It is now Thursday night for marriage camp, and it's also Thursday night here at summer camp. If you're following along with our timeline and doing this while we are away, your students are probably at some point this evening having very important conversations spiritually with either a pastor or one of the camp counselors about maybe the future of their lives. And so Thursday night is kind of a decision night at camp. Many of you have been to camp. Even you have some of the best memories that you can remember in your childhood, in your teenage years, happened at camp or retreat or something like that. And so, again, just thank you again for sending your students with me, for trusting me and our church with the spiritual guidance of your child as we partner with you. But also just thank you for all the opportunities that come with serving the Lord and serving Him with gladness. And so this week, as you've gone through marriage camp, I hope that this has been a blessing for you. I hope that you have enjoyed your time with one another, seeking out His presence, seeking out your marriage intimacy, both with God and one another. I really can't explain how important these moments can be. This inspiration for this event came last year. I've actually wanted to do this thing for years, but never been able to pull it off. Never figured out, how do I host two events when I'm not at one? I have to leave to go to camp. And last year, my wife had this brilliant idea that she would take these two books, which actually I have recommended, How a Husband Speaks, How a Woman Speaks. They go together. And at night for vacation, as the kids were asleep, we would read our little chapters. They're small. You could just kind of do that together. And we would have this discussion together. And it was such a rich time. And I was like, man, wouldn't that be great if we could provide something like that for our adults, for our parents who are sending students away to camp? And so this is kind of our attempt at that. And so I hope that this week has really stretched you. I hope that it has also drawn you closer to one another. I hope you've really enjoyed your time together, because it's coming to an end and I'm bringing your kids back to you tomorrow. But again, like, God has been good through all of this. And so I really do pray that you've enjoyed this. So this morning, you should have had your last devotion together. We were in Matthew 19. It's kind of heavy devotion material, isn't it? Well, the reason we use that text is because Jesus clearly teaches, referring to Genesis 2 in that text. And really, there's no other text where he refers to Genesis 2 so clearly. And the context that he's teaching is divorce. And so that's not really the thing that you want to talk about in intimacy, but I think it does kind of explain, okay, this is what no intimacy looks like. This is what a lack of intimacy can lead to. So you need to know the consequences of not pursuing your spouse, of not constantly pursuing a relationship that is both close and honest and open with your spouse. So we read in Matthew 19 this morning that originally there was no death. We read in Matthew 19 this morning that there was no death, there was no end, right, in God's original design. But now, because of the fall, there has to be special exceptions in our covenant. And so our covenant is no longer like, hey, you and me forever. It is now you and me until death. And that covenant really kind of leans into tonight. What we're going to be talking about tonight is not just, the intimacy, but the intimacy that comes through longevity. Intimacy is something that is cultivated over a long, long time. And the longer you're together, the closer you get. And I know some of us, we may have regrets about when we got married, or if we got married too young or too late, or if we focused too much on our career and not our spouse, whatever that case may be. You made a covenant with your spouse. And so live up to your covenant as best as you can from here moving forward so that you can dwell in this intimacy with one another. Okay, so we're still in Genesis 2. We're going to kind of round off our time, put it all together, one big concept, and it's just 24 and 25. So, think about that. We've been in only 18 through 25 all week, and God's just had so many lessons for us. Okay, so 24, 25, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Okay, so that's kind of our anchor point, but I'm really just giving you some thoughts about marriage. Okay, first, marriage is a gift. You need to realize that God is the one who gave you your spouse. You may say, well, I dated and I did this all this stuff and I talked to this person. I did this thing over here. Like, listen, just stop. Okay. God gave you your spouse for you to adore and to cherish. And at this point, if you have said, I do, that's the one. That's your one flesh. And so divorce needs to immediately come out of the idea. The idea of I never should have married her needs to come out of the equation. The idea of he's the wrong one for me, or we really aren't made for one another. Chunk it. Just get rid of it. None of those ideas really help you anymore. Because at this point, if you are in covenant with each other, this is God's gift to you, is this person. Now, that gift is not purely to make you happy. Actually, very few gifts from God are like that. Your salvation is not purely to make you happy. It's to make you like Christ. And then the same is true with your marriage relationship. God gave you a wife, all right, that you could be naked and unashamed with. That naked and unashamed means you have to be open and honest, that revealing. Okay, we talked about that last night, so that you can experience grace and forgiveness. There are things that only your spouse knows about you, and we call those the blind spots. The things that you don't even realize, that you're impatient or that you can be a little harsh with your words or things like that. Your wife, your spouse will know those things about you and be able to, point them out. That's never fun, is it? Like whenever you're having a moment, maybe you're disciplining a child or at work or something, and then your spouse is like, hey, come here for a second. And it's like, oh, darn. Like they're gonna remind you, be like, hey, maybe you shouldn't use that word. Or hey, maybe you might want to go apologize to that, child that you just blasted because he spilt his milk on the table or something, right? Like it's unfortunate, but see, God gave you your spouse to sanctify you. That's a big churchy word, and it means to become more like Christ. All right? We live in community in the church, but specifically your spouse, that community, if you will, that relationship is so that you can become more like Jesus. And through the learning of patience, through the learning of grace, not just receiving grace, but giving grace, you become more like Christ. So your marriage is a gift by God to make you more like Christ. So the discussion question, it says, spend some time, telling your spouse how you're thankful for them. We kind of did that a little bit yesterday, and you should do that again. But specifically, I'm going to lean into a little bit of a tweak because we published these books before these videos were made. How is it that your spouse is helping you to become more like Christ? God gave you your spouse so that it be for your good and His glory. Your good is to become more like Christ so that you might glorify Him even more, right? I have come that you might bear fruit, that you may bear even much fruit, that abundant life that Jesus says. Like all of these phrases, your spouse actually helps you get there. Your spouse will help prune you spiritually. The things that are distractions in your life, the things that you spend too much time doing, learning how to sacrifice, all of that comes out of marriage. Why is that God does that? Because, number 2, marriage is an offering. Okay, so here's a thought that we saw back in Ephesians. You one day will present your spouse as an offering, a sacrifice to God. Your vow, again, is until death do you part. One day you will no longer belong to one another. Eventually, your covenant will end. One of you will go to heaven before the other one does. One of you will experience the resurrection, maybe. And God is going to use you to prepare that person to become like Christ. Why? So that you can then offer them up as a steward to God as an offering. Really think about this idea. Stop, pause, ponder for a second. A steward belongs to the master. He has a responsibility. None of his stuff is his. Everything that he manages belongs to the master. Every time Jesus taught a story about the kingdom of heaven is like this, he would say, and then he would refer to there was a master, or there was a vineyard owner, right? Or there was a king, right? And God always represents that, and Christ represents that person, right? God is the master vine dresser. God is the owner of the vineyard, and he had the vineyard. He built a hedge around it. He did all those things. And then he sent servants or stewards to tend the vineyard or the flock or whatever the parable may be. It's always in that kind of relationship where there's the master and the stewards. You are a steward of your family, of your spouse, and of your children. Your spouse does not belong to you. He or she belongs to Christ. Your children do not belong to you. He or she belongs to Christ. Like, we understand that when we die, we can't take our stuff with us, right? So whether it's your house or your cars or boats or whatever it is that you amass and all your wealth and assets, like, listen, when you die, guess what? It just goes on to somebody else. Like, the richest man in the world still died and was buried in the same earth that all the other people were buried in. Same is true of your children. Your children will outlast you. Your spouse may outlast you. Your legacy from your marriage should definitely and will, one way or another, outlast you, even if it's good or if it's bad. You see, God wants you to offer up your spouse as an offering to him. You are to help him or her become blameless and pure, maturing in their faith, so that one day you can offer up that spouse to God as an act of worship. As an act of worship. So think about this. If you are to offer up yourselves as living sacrifices, and it says in Scripture, that's Romans 12:2, offer up your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to the Lord. All right, this is your spiritual act of worship. You are to love your spouse as your own body, is another reference. If you're to love your spouse as your own body, and you are to offer up your body as a living sacrifice, you are to offer up your spouse then as a sacrifice to the Lord, holy and pleasing before him. You are to lead your spouse well. And this does not just mean husbands. You're responsible as head of the household, yes, but your wife is just as responsible over you, husband, to help you become more like Christ. So now jump into the second discussion time. How are you leading each other to become more like Christ? How are you offering up one another? Your covenant is like, hey, I'm going to join together with you so that we can worship and glorify God together, and then one day offer up each other as an act of worship to God. Okay, let's put a bow on this entire series, on this entire week, and let's just lean into this third point. Marriage is a covenant. It's not a contract. It's not an agreement. It's not something where you're saying, hey, I do my part, you do your part, we make each other happy, right? That's codependency. We talked about that. This is, I am taking my life and I am aligning it to your life until one of us no longer has life. See, a contract has terms that you both agree to and things like that. A covenant is a living agreement between two living people. In the Old Testament, we have examples of covenants that people made with one another or that God made with people. One of them I just really kind of want to lean into. God makes a covenant with Abraham. And the way they would make their covenants back then is they would slaughter animals, like cut them in half and put them on either side and make like a row. And then they would pass in between these slaughtered animals. And essentially they're saying, if I do not hold up my end of the covenant, let me become like one of these slaughtered animals, okay? So imagine this. God has this covenant with Abraham. God causes Abraham to fall into a deep sleep, and then God walks through the animals alone. One, because he knows that Abraham will never, ever, ever hold up to his covenant. Not just him, but his descendants. No one will perfectly be able to obey God. Why? Because we're full of sin. So he doesn't even allow Abraham to walk through this covenant knowing that they're going to fail. Yet Abraham walks into this covenant with God because God walks through it on his own. Now, here's what's interesting. The slaughtered animals. That represents Christ. Christ became the slaughtered animal, even though God held up his end of the bargain. He held up his covenant, but his covenant was to redeem a people for himself. And he did that through the killing, through the crucifixion of his son. Husband and wife, you are in covenant relationship with one another. A covenant relationship is marked by sacrifice. Everything you do must be to uphold and extol the other person. Everything you say and everything that you encourage, everything that you model, everything that you even try to teach one another must be out of sacrifice and glory to God. Because see, when you covenant together in marriage, when you have your marriage vows, you're saying, I'm in it. No escape. No escape. You see, if you go back to that Matthew 19 passage, there was this little phrase that Jesus says. He says, because of the hardness of your hearts, God gave you an out in your marriage. And so Jesus is saying it's permissible, but not desirable. Permissible, not desirable. God's desire is that you would treat one another like he has treated us, with forgiveness and grace. Are there consequences? Yes. Will there maybe be a loss of trust? Yes. There's so many reasons that you can go further with this, and there needs to be more counseling in all of these conversations if you find yourself in such a situation as this. There are reasons that you guys may have to navigate some very difficult seasons in life. But God's desire overall is that you would be covenanted together through thick and thin. My prayer is that you can do that. My prayer is that the covenant becomes the protective layer for your sanctification, for your goodness, for your intimacy with both God and one another. You see, that covenant marriage that you wear together, and I say wear because I'm making this circle statement, what it reminds us of a ring, this thing right here. And it's to let all the floozies know that I'm taken, right? No, it's so that we can declare to others, I belong to someone. This is my protective layer to protect me. We talked about how are you protecting your marriage. We've talked about how are you pursuing one another. We've talked about how are you growing in your intimacy. How are you growing as one flesh? How are you pursuing one another so that you may extol one another, lifting each other up so that you can offer one another as a living sacrifice to God one day, because marriage does end. One of my favorite books that I've read, and to be honest, the only book I've read on this subject, is by Pastor Tim here at our church. He wrote this book, I Bear Witness, about his wife and about their marriage and about how to end your marriage with grace and dignity and love. And he presented in this book his wife as a sacrifice, as an offering to God. Not everybody does that. Not everybody does that. My goal for you is that you have a marriage that will last, that will endure, that goes the long haul, that will never be shaken, that will never have any sort of chink in the armor or anything like that, that you will always grow in intimacy with God and one another. Thank you so much for joining me this week for Marriage Camp. I pray that this has been an opportunity for you to really grow in your marriage, grow as an individual and grow as a couple. My prayer for you is that you have grown just in the things that you've talked about, things that only you talk about, which is why we gave discussion time. Intimacy only works whenever it's you and your spouse. Like, I can't have you saying the exact same things that everybody else is saying because we're not all in the same marriage. You have yours, I'm in mine. And so I pray that you have had great and rich discussion, great prayer time, great time with just the Lord, where you can realize I love my spouse and that my spouse is a gift from him. And I pray that this can just be a renewal moment for you that you continually pursue your spouse so that you can have intimacy, that you can be fully seen, fully known, fully understood, and yet fully loved because of grace and forgiveness. Thank you for joining me this week, and I'll see you tomorrow night when I drop off all your kids. God bless you.